A night flight from New York to Zurich, Meridian Atlantic Flight 812, Boeing 787-9, tail number N812MA. The business cabin glowed with soft blue light. In seat 27A, Victoria Hale, 32, CEO of Hale Capital Partners, was complaining. "I paid $9,400 for this seat," she said, loud enough for the row to hear, "and I'm sitting next to a
This isn't a
single
place for
father
children."
wiping baby formula off his hands." A few passengers laughed quietly.
Daddy's gonna help
The
fly
man
the
in
plane,
27C
sweetheart.
just
Stay right
bowed
here with
his
Mrs.
head
Alvarez.
and comforted
Daddy's
his
doing what
frightened
Mommy
daughter.
taught him.
The little girl gripped her father's hand. "Daddy, the plane is shaking." He smiled. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just wind." Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered. The captain's voice cut through the intercom, strained. "We've lost contact with air traffic control." Victoria froze. The father stood up slowly, and something in his face was a look no one on that flight would forget. Daniel Reyes, 37 years old, single father, former Air Force combat rescue pilot. He'd left the service after an accident and his wife's death. Now he worked as an aircraft maintenance technician at LaGuardia, raising his 8-year-old daughter Madison alone. On this flight, he just wanted to take her to Zurich to see her aunt for a scheduled cardiac evaluation at University Hospital Zurich. Victoria Hale, 32, CEO of a private equity firm headquartered at 450 Park Avenue, arrogant. She'd once told a reporter that people who couldn't afford first class had no business complaining about how the rest of the world traveled. She was flying to Zurich to close a $340 million infrastructure fund. When she saw Daniel and Madison sitting beside her, she was irritated. "This isn't a place for children," she said. Daniel spoke gently. "My daughter will be good. We just want a peaceful flight." Victoria glanced at the faded maintenance patch on his sleeve, laughing under her breath. "You're a technician. You probably don't understand what this ticket cost." Madison said innocently, "Daddy flies planes really well." Victoria waved a hand. "Anyone's good at flying, sweetheart, on a screen." Daniel just smiled. He'd heard worse during his years overseas. The flight attendant offered wine. Victoria laughed. "Give me the most expensive bottle you have. Might help me forget I'm sitting next to someone who wipes down airplane wings for a living." Daniel said quietly, "People who wipe wings sometimes understand the sky better than people who only fly for money." She turned away, embarrassed, covering it with a short laugh. But Daniel's story ran much deeper than Victoria could have imagined from where she sat. 4 years ago, he'd been Captain Daniel Reyes, call sign Talon 5, one of the most decorated combat rescue pilots in his squadron. Over 180 combat missions, the kind of missions other pilots went quiet just hearing briefed. His wife, Rachel, had been a civilian flight instructor. They'd met at an air show in Oshkosh, married within the year, had Madison 2 years after that. Then came the mission that ended it. His wingman, Colonel Richard Hale, Victoria's father, took ground fire and went down. Daniel stayed on the radio, guided him toward friendly lines, held his own damaged aircraft together until Hale ejected safely. Daniel ejected seconds later, too low, too fast. He shattered his spine on impact. While he was still in traction at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Rachel was killed by a drunk driver 3 miles from the hospital gate. She never saw it coming. Now the seatbelt light lit up. The aircraft began to shake, harder than before. Madison hugged her father's arm. Victoria gripped her wine glass, unsteady. "Don't worry," Daniel said, "just turbulence." "I don't need you to teach me," she snapped. But it got worse. Lightning tore across the windows. The plane dropped violently, without warning. Victoria's wine spilled across the front of her white blazer, spreading red like something that couldn't be taken back. The captain's voice came through again, and this time it wasn't controlled at all. "The first officer has lost consciousness. We need help in the cockpit, immediately." A pause, then braking. "Is there a combat pilot on this aircraft? Please, anybody, is there a combat pilot on this aircraft?" If you're enjoying this story so far, subscribe. It only takes a second. Now, watch what happens next. For 3 seconds, nobody in the cabin moved. Then Daniel Reyes unbelted his seatbelt. A young man near the back, mid-20s, still in a University of Maryland ROTC hoodie, twisted around in his seat and said loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "That's Talon 5! That's Captain Reyes!" The cabin went electric. Victoria stared at him like she was seeing a stranger for the first time, because she was. Daniel stood, straightened his jacket, and looked down at Madison. He knelt beside her seat, pulled off his own jacket, and draped it over her shoulders. "Daddy's going to help fly the plane, sweetheart. I need you to stay right here and hold on to Mrs. Alvarez's hand." He nodded to the flight attendant crouched in the aisle. "Can you do that for me?" Madison's eyes were wide, but she nodded. "Daddy's doing what Mommy taught him to." "That's right. Always do things for other people." He walked toward the cockpit, and for the first time since lawn stool, his hands were shaking. It had been 4 years since he'd touched a yoke, since he'd heard a stall horn, since he'd felt an aircraft respond to his hands, instead of just watching other men fly them past his hangar window while he wiped grease off a cowling. The cockpit door opened. Captain Alan Whitfield, gray at the temples, sweat on his collar, looked up with something close to desperation. "Sir, I don't know if I can hold her. Hydraulics are failing on the left side. We're losing altitude, and I've got a first officer down." "Let me in," Daniel said, sliding into the right seat. His hands found the controls the way a man finds a door frame in the dark, not by sight, but by memory that never actually left. The training came back before his fear did. Fuel state, altitude, airspeed, position. He was cataloging it all in under 4 seconds, the way he'd been trained to at 23 years old, flying rescue missions over terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was 241 civilians. This was his own daughter, 11 rows back, sitting under his jacket. "Talk to me, sir," Whitfield said.
Left hydraulic system's gone. We're flying on manual reversion and whatever's left in the right side. I need a diversion airfield with a long runway and full crash response. Where's the nearest military field? Ramstein, about 40 minutes northeast. Daniel had been stationed at Ramstein Air Base for 2 years. He knew the runway length, the approach corridors, the terrain on either side of the glide path better than he knew most streets in his own neighborhood. He keyed the radio. "Ramstein approach, this is Meridian Atlantic 812 declaring an emergency, requesting immediate clearance, hydraulic failure, unresponsive first officer, I am a rated combat pilot assisting the flight crew, call sign Talon 5. Static. Then a pause that lasted just a beat too long. A voice came back through the speaker, and something in it had changed. "Talon 5? Reyes? Is that actually you?" "Affirmative, Tower, and I need that runway cleared because we're coming in on one working system and not a lot of altitude to spare." "Copy that, Talon 5. Runway 26 is yours. Full length, crash and rescue standing by. Good to hear your voice again, brother." Daniel's eyes went wet for half a second before he blinked it away. "Good to be back, Tower. Wish it wasn't under better circumstances." The voice on the radio was Master Sergeant Curtis Boone, a former crew chief who'd worked Daniel's aircraft for 2 years at Ramstein and hadn't heard from him since the medical discharge paperwork went through. There wasn't time to say any of that now. There was only the approach. "Airspeed's decaying on the left turn," Whitfield said, hands tight on the yoke beside him. "Ease off the bank. Keep it shallow. We don't have the hydraulic authority for anything sharp." Daniel's voice was flat, controlled, the voice he used to use over a headset at 12,000 feet with a wingman losing altitude in his ear. "Flaps to 20, gear down when I call it, not before." The aircraft shuddered through 8,000 feet, then 6,000, crosswinds shoving at the fuselage every few seconds. Behind them, the cabin was silent, except for a child crying 2 rows behind Madison and the low murmur of a flight attendant reciting brace positions no one wanted to hear. At 300 feet, the ground came up fast through driving rain, lights strobing red and white along both edges of the tarmac. Daniel called the gear down, felt it lock, felt the aircraft settle into that final unstable second before touchdown that never got easier no matter how many times you did it. The wheels hit hard, bounced once, held. Reverse thrust, spoilers. The deceleration threw everyone forward against their belts, and then, impossibly, they were rolling, slowing, stopping, alive, on a wet runway at Ramstein Air Base at 11:52 p.m. local time. The cabin erupted, not screaming this time, applause, sobbing, someone shouting a name that wasn't anyone's in particular, just relief that needed somewhere to go. Daniel sat still for a moment, hands still on the controls, breathing like he'd just run 6 miles. Whitfield reached over and gripped his shoulder. "You just saved 241 lives, Captain. You make sure everyone gets checked out. That's thanks enough, Dan." He walked back through the cabin on legs that didn't quite feel like his own, past rows of people reaching out to touch his sleeve, to say something, to just look at him. He didn't stop for any of it. He went straight to row 27, knelt, and Madison threw both arms around his neck. "You did it, Daddy. We did it, baby girl." Victoria Hale stood in the aisle, still in her wine-stained blazer, watching him hold his daughter like landing a crippled 787 in a thunderstorm was something that happened to him on a Tuesday. She didn't say anything. She couldn't find anything that felt big enough. Emergency vehicles ringed the aircraft, lights sweeping red and blue across the wet tarmac outside the windows. A ground crew truck pulled up to the forward stairs, and through the open cockpit door, Victoria caught a sight of something on Daniel's wrist as he lifted Madison into his arms. A faded tattoo, a set of wings over a number. 401 Rescue Squadron. Her father's unit. She stared at it for a long moment, and something cold moved through her chest, because she knew exactly which mission had ended with that squadron losing a pilot, and she had spent her whole life hearing her father talk about the man who saved his life and never came home the same. If Daniel's story has you hooked, subscribe for more stories where the truth changes everything. Now, listen to what Victoria discovers. They were moved to a hangar at Ramstein while ground crews inspected the aircraft, passengers wrapped in gray Air Force-issue blankets, drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, some still crying, some already laughing with the particular hysteria that comes after fear passes through a body and leaves it empty. Daniel had fallen asleep against his shoulder within 10 minutes, his jacket still wrapped around him twice. Victoria found him near a folding table at the edge of the hangar, alone except for his sleeping daughter. That tattoo, the wings, 401. Daniel looked up. 401st Rescue Squadron. Why? "My father was in the 401. Her voice had none of its usual edge now. "Colonel Richard Hale. He flew with a wingman who went down covering his ejection, stayed on the radio with him the whole way out, talked him through a bad descent, held his own aircraft together with no hydraulics and no business still flying it. My father always said that man saved his life and never came home the same." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Your father made it out. He's alive because of that pilot. He's never stopped saying so. He tried for years to find out what happened to him afterward. The Air Force wouldn't release medical information, and then he just disappeared. My father always wondered if he made it." "He made it," Daniel said quietly. "Barely."
Victoria's hand went to her mouth. "It was you! Richard Hale is your father." "He's my father." She sat down hard on the bench across from him, all the practiced composure she'd walked onto that flight with completely gone. "You're the reason I have a father, and I sat next to you for 3 hours and called you a technician who wipes wings for a living. You didn't know." "That's not an excuse," her voice cracked. "I should have asked. I should have wondered why a man with the hands that steady was flying commercial as a passenger with a maintenance patch on his jacket, instead of assuming the worst thing I could think of him." Daniel shifted Madison gently against his shoulder. I got out of the Air Force with a spine that doesn't do overhead compartments anymore, and a commercial pilot's license I let expire because I couldn't afford the recurrency training and raise a kid on a technician's salary at the same time. People see the jacket, they don't ask what's under it. Most days, that's fine by me. It's not fine. It's not fine that a man who saved my father's life is wiping down landing gear at LaGuardia while people like me fly first class and mock him for it. She pressed her palms against her eyes. God, you didn't know my story, that's true. But you're right that it shouldn't have mattered whether you knew it or not. Madison stirred, blinking up at Victoria with sleepy, unguarded honesty. Are you the mean lady from the plane? Madison, Daniel said gently. It's okay, Victoria said, crouching down to the girl's eye level, something in her face breaking open. Yes, I was. I'm sorry. Madison considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can produce. Daddy says everyone has a story. You just have to listen to it. Victoria looked at Daniel over the girl's head, eyes wet. He's right. By 2 a.m., a Meridian Atlantic operations manager had confirmed the flight would remain grounded at Ramstein overnight for full inspection, with passengers rebooked on a replacement aircraft the following afternoon. Word had already reached the airline's Zurich office. Word had already started reaching further than that. A passenger's shaky cell phone video of Daniel walking into the cockpit and later of him carrying Madison off the aircraft had been uploaded before the wheels had even stopped rolling. By morning, it had 4 million views, and the caption read, "Pilot hidden in plain sight saves 241 lives on Flight 812. Victoria read it standing outside the hangar at dawn, coffee going cold in her hand, and thought about the board meeting she'd have to explain herself in by Monday morning, and about the fact that the man in that video had spent 4 years being invisible to people like her. By Monday morning, the video had 11 million views. News outlets picked it up by name: the New York Times, Der Spiegel, a segment on CNN International that ran the cell phone footage next to a photo of Daniel in his old flight suit that someone from his old squadron had dug up and sent to a reporter. The headline that stuck was the one from an aviation blog: "Combat Rescue Pilot Hidden in Plain Sight Saves Flight 812. Hale Capital's board convened an emergency call at 8 a.m. Eastern. Victoria sat at the head of the conference table on the 14th floor of 450 Park Avenue in Boardroom C and let them talk for 11 minutes before she said anything. The man in that video is Daniel Reyes. He saved my father's life in 2022. My father has told that story at every Thanksgiving dinner for 4 years without knowing his name. And 2 days ago, I called him a technician who wipes wings for a living. Nobody said anything. We're not managing a PR situation. We're going to do something that's actually right, and if it happens to also be good for the firm, that's not why we're doing it. She left the meeting and drove to Rego Park, Queens, to a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on 63rd Drive. Daniel answered the door in a T-shirt with a coffee stain on it, Madison visible behind him at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and a half-finished drawing of an airplane. "Mrs. Hale?" he said, surprised. "Victoria, please." I hold up a folder. "Can I come in for a minute?" The apartment was small, clean, sparse in the way of someone who'd learned to live carefully. A single framed photo sat on a bookshelf, a woman in a flight instructor's uniform, laughing mid-runway, propeller blurred behind her. "That's Mommy," Madison said, not looking up from her drawing. "She's an angel now." Victoria's throat tightened. "She's beautiful." "She was," Daniel said quietly. Victoria set the folder on the counter. "I want to offer you a position, Director of Flight Safety and Veterans Affairs at Hale Capital's Aviation Holdings. We own an 11% stake in Meridian Atlantic and full ownership of 2 regional charter companies. 6 figures, full benefits, and you build the department the way you think it should be built." Daniel looked at the folder without opening it. "I appreciate it, I do, but I've got a 7-year-old who needs me home for dinner, and I don't need to be rescued, Victoria. I already got out. This isn't charity. It feels like guilt. Maybe it started as guilt, maybe, she admitted, but I spent the last 36 hours finding out how many people like you work for companies like mine, mechanics who flew Apaches, security guards who ran special forces teams in Kandahar, a janitor in our Charlotte office who has a master's degree in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech and can't get an interview because his resume has an 18-month gap where he was in a VA hospital. I didn't know any of that 3 days ago because I never asked. I'm asking now. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Madison had stopped drawing and was watching them both. I don't want to be your redemption story, he said finally. I want peace for my daughter. That's it. That's the whole list. I understand that. Victoria stood to leave. The offer doesn't expire, and for what it's worth, you already are somebody's redemption story. You just don't know whose yet.
She left the folder on the counter. Madison waited until the door closed, then looked up at her father. "Daddy, are we going to say yes?" "I don't know, baby girl." "She said sorry with her eyes," Madison said, going back to her drawing. "Mommy always said that's the real kind." Daniel picked up the folder that night after Madison was asleep, sat at the kitchen table under a single lamp, and read it twice before he finally opened his laptop and started an email he wasn't sure yet he'd send. He never sent the email that night. 3 days later, he didn't need to. Hale Capital had recently taken a controlling stake in Iron Bridge Aerostructures, a composite aircraft manufacturer outside Wichita, Kansas, that was 6 weeks from the first test flight of its new regional jet, the Iron Bridge IR-9. Victoria had flown out for the milestone. Good press, good timing, a chance to stand on a tarmac and announce something better than an apology. Daniel was there too, though not for the reason anyone expected. Madison's school was on spring recess, and he'd asked Iron Bridge's chief test pilot, an old acquaintance from his Air Force days, if his daughter could tour the hangar. He hadn't come for Victoria. He hadn't planned on seeing her at all. He was standing on the observation deck at Eisenhower National Airport, Madison's hand in his, watching the IR-9 taxi onto runway 1L when the radio chatter from the tower speaker mounted on the deck wall changed pitch. "Iron Bridge 9-1, say again, we're showing a flight control fault indication." To "We have a pitch control anomaly. Aircraft is not responding to manual trim inputs, requesting immediate..." Daniel didn't think. He was moving before he'd finished processing what he'd heard, Madison's hand slipping out of his as he ran for the tower stairs 2 at a time, badge from his morning tour visit still clipped to his jacket. "This is Daniel Reyes, call sign Talon 5. I flew rescue out of the 401st. Get me on that frequency now." The tower controller didn't ask questions. She handed him the microphone. "Iron Bridge 9-1, this is Reyes. Ted, talk to me. What's the trim doing?" The test pilot's voice came back tight, controlled the way trained voices get right before they aren't. "Trim's frozen, nose down. I've got maybe 800 feet and losing it. Manual override isn't taking." "Check your circuit breaker panel. Row 3 should be labeled pitch trim aux. Pull it and reset. If that doesn't clear it, you're going to have to fly this thing on differential thrust and elevator alone, and I need you to trust me that it's flyable that way. I've done it in worse aircraft than this one." A pause. The breaker reset. A beat of silence that felt like it lasted an hour. "Trim's responding. Christ, Trim's responding." "Bring her around. Gentle bank. Keep the nose up. I've got you the whole way down." Daniel stayed on that microphone for 6 minutes, walking the aircraft through a wide pattern and back onto the runway. His voice never once lost the flat, steady calm that Madison, watching from the deck below with her hands pressed against the glass, had heard once before, over a different radio, on a different night. The IR-9 touched down hard but held, rolled to a stop 300 feet short of the overrun. Emergency crews swarmed the fuselage.
The forward door opened, and Victoria came down the stairs shaking, her legs barely holding her, and walked straight into Daniel's arms without a word. "You didn't have to answer that radio. You don't work for us. You don't owe me anything," she said into his shoulder, voice breaking. "I know," Daniel said. "I answered it anyway." He didn't let go of her right away, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, standing on the tarmac at Eisenhower with emergency lights still turning red and blue against the fuselage of the IR-9. Madison came running across the ramp a moment later, out of breath, and wrapped her arms around both of them at once without asking permission. "Why do you keep saving me?" Victoria asked later, once she'd stopped shaking, sitting on the tailgate of a ground crew truck with a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "Because that's the job," Daniel said. "You protect people, even the ones who don't see you, even the ones who think you're worth less than the ticket in their hand. That doesn't stop being true just because I turned in my wings. You're not a pilot anymore. I'll always be one. It's not a job title, it's who I am." Victoria pressed her palms against her eyes. "I'm so sorry, for all of it, not just the plane, for never once in my entire life wondering what the people around me had actually survived to get where they were standing." "You're wondering now," Daniel said. "That's more than most people ever do." The board meeting she called for the following Tuesday ran 3 hours over schedule. She stood at the head of the table in Boardroom C and told them Hale Capital was launching something called the Talent Initiative, a full skills assessment and hiring pipeline for military veterans across every company in the portfolio, a newly created position, Director of Flight Safety and Veterans Affairs, reporting directly to her. "He doesn't have an MBA, one board member said. "He's never run a department." "He's saved more lives in the last 2 weeks than this entire boardroom combined has in its collective career," Victoria said. "If that's not a qualification, I don't know what you think we're actually building here."
She won the vote, not on the numbers, but because nobody in that room could look her in the eye and argue against it after watching the IR-9 footage circulate on every business news channel in the country. The press conference was held 11 days later at Iron Bridge's Wichita facility. Victoria at the podium, Daniel beside her looking uncomfortable in a blazer that wasn't his own, Madison in the front row swinging her legs off a folding chair too tall for her. Today, we're announcing the Talent Initiative, named for the call sign of the man who saved my father's life 8 years ago, and who saved mine 3 weeks ago, and who has spent the years in between wiping down landing gear because nobody thought to ask what he used to do before that. She paused. That ends today, not just for him, for every veteran in this room who's been invisible in a job that never should have been the last stop on their resume. The room stood and applauded. Somewhere near the back, a cluster of men in matching flight jackets, Daniel's old squadron mates, flown in without his knowledge, stood and saluted. Daniel stepped to the microphone, visibly unsure what to do with his hands. "I didn't do any of this for recognition. I did it because it's the job. Whether I'm in a cockpit or standing on a tarmac with a radio in my hand, that doesn't change." Afterward, walking through the parking lot with Madison between them, holding both their hands, Victoria said quietly, "Thank you for everything." Daniel just shook his head. "Thank me by treating the next person you meet with respect before you know their story. That's the only thanks I need." Daniel's office at Hale Capital's Long Island City Annex became something nobody on the executive floor quite expected. It was small, a converted conference room, Suite 4B, with a window facing the East River, but by the second month there was almost always someone in the chair across from his desk, former airman looking for work, a retired Army logistics sergeant who couldn't get past the resume screener at 3 different firms because she didn't know how to translate convoy operations, Fort Bragg, into corporate language. A former Marine Corps mechanic named Ruiz, who'd been driving for a rideshare app for 2 years and didn't know Iron Bridge had an entire composites division that needed exactly his certifications. Daniel never turned anyone away. His door, an actual door, which he insisted on when they gave him the office, because he'd learned in 8 years of Air Force briefings that some conversations needed a door that closed, stayed open until whoever needed to talk had said what they came to say. Word moved through the veteran community the way it always does, quietly and completely. If you need help, go see Talon 5 at Hale Capital. He'll take care of you. Victoria found herself there most evenings by 7, ostensibly reviewing numbers for the initiative, actually just watching how he did it, how he asked questions instead of offering advice, how he let a 26-year-old former convoy gunner sit in silence for 4 full minutes before saying anything at all, how nobody who walked out of that office looked smaller than when they walked in. "You should go home, Daniel," she told him one night in October. "Madison needs you. She's with her aunt in Astoria tonight, study group project." He didn't look up from the file he was reading. "These people need me right now." "You can't save everyone, Daniel." "Maybe not, but I can try." By November, the Talon Initiative had launched a veterans pilot retraining program, full certification funding for former military aviators who'd been medically discharged or simply priced out of civilian recurrency training. 20 veterans in the first cohort. Daniel reviewed every application himself. "This one," he said, sliding a file across the desk toward Victoria, "flew medevac Blackhawks in Kandahar, 3 tours. Medical discharge after a hard landing tore up her knee. She thinks her flying days are done." "Do you think she's wrong?" "I know she's wrong, because I was wrong about the same thing." He paused. "I started simulator training last month, at LaGuardia, on my own time." Victoria looked up. "You're flying again?" "Trying to, baby steps. Might actually get back in a real cockpit someday, for real, not just an emergency." "What changed?" "You did. Not," he caught himself, recalibrated. "You showed me the past doesn't have to be the whole story, that falling doesn't mean you don't get back up. I spent 4 years telling myself I was done, and it took watching you rebuild something after one bad flight to remember I never actually believed that about myself." Victoria felt something rise in her throat she hadn't expected. "I'm not brave, Daniel. I just finally started paying attention. That's its own kind of brave." He closed the file. "We're building something that matters here, both of us, different ways of getting to the same place." By December, all 20 veterans in the retraining cohort had logged their required simulator hours. Daniel had logged 11 of his own, quietly without telling anyone at the office, in a rented Cessna 172 out of Republic Airport on Sunday mornings before Madison woke up, the first time in 4 years he'd touched a set of controls that weren't attached to somebody else's emergency. 2 years after Flight 812 landed at Rhymstein, Hale Capital's aviation holdings had become the largest private sector employer of transitioning veterans on the East Coast. 312 former service members placed across pilot, maintenance, logistics, and engineering roles. The Talon Initiative had been adopted by 9 other airlines and 2 aerospace manufacturers, including, eventually, Ironbridge Aerostructures itself, which now ran its entire quality assurance division under a former Army Ordnance officer Daniel interviewed personally in Suite 4B.
Victoria had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Hale Capital, handing the CEO title to her COO while she ran the initiative full-time. She'd told a reporter for Fortune that year that making money had always come easily to her, and it wasn't until she was 32 that she learned what actually felt like something. "People ask me why I stepped back," she said at the Aspen Aviation Leadership Summit that spring, standing at a podium with her father, Colonel Richard Hale, retired, seated in the front row. "The honest answer is that I asked the wrong question my whole career. I kept asking, who is qualified? I should have been asking, who knows how to sacrifice?" Daniel had earned his commercial pilot's license back in March, 18 months of simulator hours and recurrency training, and one very nervous check ride with an examiner who'd recognized his name from the news and tried, unsuccessfully, to hide how starstruck he was. He flew part-time now,
first officer on regional Hale-affiliated routes out of LaGuardia, while still running the veterans program 4 days a week. The first time he took Madison up in a rented Cessna out of Republic Airport, she'd gripped the yoke with both hands in straight and level flight and shrieked with a kind of joy she hadn't heard from her since before the hospital, before the funeral, before any of it. "Daddy, we're flying. We're really flying." "We really are, baby girl." Victoria had been waiting at the hangar when they landed, and Madison ran to her before she ran to anyone else, breathless. "It was perfect, perfect, perfect." "I believe you," she said, and looked at Daniel over the girl's head with something that had been building quietly for 2 years, and neither of them had said out loud yet. She'd told him finally, one evening in April, standing outside Suite 4B after everyone else had gone home. "I know this is complicated. I know I don't have any right to expect anything from you after how I treated you, but I love you, and I needed you to actually hear that, not just guess it." Daniel had been quiet for a long moment. "I know. Madison told me weeks ago. She's very perceptive." A small, honest smile. "I'm not ready yet. Maybe someday. I'm still figuring out who I am after everything, and I need to finish that before I can be right for anyone. I can wait. You shouldn't have to. I want to. You're worth it." They left it there, not together, not apart, something being built quietly in the space between, the way the best things usually are. That October, Hale Ironbridge unveiled its newest regional aircraft, the IR-12, at a ceremony on the tarmac at Republic Airport. Engraved along the nose beneath the cockpit window were 6 words Victoria had insisted on herself: "Fly for those we love." Daniel flew the inaugural flight. Victoria, who'd earned her private pilot's license that summer through the same retraining program she'd helped fund, sat in the right seat. Madison, 9 years old now, sat in the cabin behind them, wearing a set of junior wings pinned to her jacket, sketching clouds in a notebook. As they climbed out over Long Island Sound into a clear afternoon sky, the tower radio crackled. "IR-12, this is Tower. Beautiful takeoff. Welcome home, Talon 5. Daniel keyed the mic, and for the first time in 8 years, the words came without any weight behind them at all, just simple and true. "Good to be home, Tower." Below them, the world spread out, complicated and imperfect, and full of people who deserved better than to be judged by what they wore on their sleeve. Above them, clear sky, all the way up. "Daddy," called Madison from the cabin, "are we flying high enough yet?" Daniel grinned, glancing at Victoria, then back at the horizon opening in front of them. "Not yet, baby girl, but we're getting there."